Good morning, everyone. I'm very excited today to be sitting down with Harinder Takhar. He is the CEO of Paytm Labs in Canada, which is the research and development division of Paytm, which is the largest FinTech player in India. But prior to that, he was actually the first CEO of Paytm. So I just want to start out with Paytm.
Sure.
Just a quick summary of what it is and how it went from mobile to e-commerce and everything else that it's become.
All right. So Paytm is a mobile payments and commerce company in India. We enable people to pay for their Uber rides or pay for their food at a restaurant. We allow people to buy movie tickets, flight tickets, whatever else have you. So we mostly work within the mobile app. Android is way more than iOS, as you would expect in India. We have quite a lot of people who do quite a lot of transactions with us. And very recently, we launched our Paytm Payments Bank. It was on the 23rd of May. So with that, we are actually getting more and more into financial services. We actually use a lot of our data to figure out what financial services people could get. An example is people who previously would not have gotten a loan would get a loan from us and so on.
Mm-hmm. And now Paytm has grown to more than 200 million users, and this Canada arm is important to making the service run smoothly, right? Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing in Canada?
Sure. The Canada arm started in 2014, near the end of 2014. At that point, we figured that data is an important thing, and we must do something around data to make sense. And there were a few things that we had in mind, but we started with one, and that was fraud detection. So we were doing, at that point, a few million transactions a day, and fraud is a classic needle in a haystack problem, in which it is very important for you to know, to use computers and no longer use any humans to find out what kind of fraud could be happening. So we set up a machine learning skill lab, and then we went on to do more things using machine learning. So today on the app, a lot of things are automated, where machines decide what you could see, whether this transaction is good or bad, and so on. So that's the starting point for our Canada office.
But you've also actually built a product for Canadian consumers, right?
Yes. So having been in Canada for a couple of years, we decided that, well, maybe we should take a shot at understanding the Canadian consumers. We found that there is a gap in the bill payment space. So we launched our app, in fact, very recently. It's been less than 3 months.
Okay, so I can imagine the Indian consumer must be vastly different from the Canadian one. I mean, what are some interesting cultural differences that you found?
They are as opposite ends of the spectrum as I can imagine. The most stark difference is that the Indian consumer would typically stay in queue for a couple of hours to save some money. The Canadian consumer would spend some money to avoid being in that queue.
Probably like the American consumer as well.
And I think so, yeah. I mean, the Canadian consumer should not be very different from the American consumer. So in that sense, definitely it is a good starting point for us. So that's the first difference. We believe that it's a very different value proposition. We don't chase discounts over here. We don't chase something cheaper over here so much as convenience. The other thing is the regulatory framework. The regulatory framework, I would say, in Canada is different. I would say in some places it is much more mature, in other places it is still figuring out. So these are, I think, the two different things. I mean, consumers, especially in the area of financial services and payments, they don't really follow the same behaviors across borders.
So is this kind of a test of the North American market, or do you really have sights to bring some sort of consumer product to North America that's...
So I'll say at this stage, it is a test. We are trying to see that we, as a company that was born and grew up in India, what we can do to make the life of a Canadian consumer easy. And if we crack that and we have a very good proof of concept, then there is no reason why we should not explore doing it for any other country in the world.
Mm-hmm. And I want to shift gears to back to India. You recently received approval from the Reserve Bank of India to start a payments bank, and it just started operations. Can you tell me a little bit about what that's been like so far and what the ultimate banking ambitions are?
The launch started in a very humble way. We literally had like one branch and a few tellers banking with that branch and so on. But just like we did with the Paytm app, we believe that our app will actually serve as a better branch and will do a much bigger outreach. We offer savings accounts and current accounts to businesses and small consumers today, and that is pretty much all we do as of now. Going forward, there is a whole host of financial services that we could offer to people, and that's definitely on the agenda. I'll say one of the things which I personally am looking forward to happen very soon is our app would literally have services that you could order from the app itself, and in case it requires you to interact with a person who is a bank employee or something, then you would request that person. You would request for that service, and let's say there is a KYC document that you need to upgrade, or you need to withdraw some cash. You would see some people on the map, and one of those will actually come to you, probably in a two-wheeler or something, and do the transaction for you. I think that being in India allows for us to think of these things. We actually might have to do this instead of installing bank branches and all that infrastructure across the country.
Wow. Okay, I want to dig into that a little bit more, but first of all, Prime Minister Modi has helped Paytm in many ways with the announcement of demonetization. There was an astronomical growth for digital payment platforms, especially Paytm. What was that experience like, and what have been the ensuing opportunities and growing pains as a result of adding so many users in such a short span of time?
I'm going to make a correction first. Prime Minister Modi did a lot to remove the corruption and to change the underlying problems that come with cash. Paytm was very good at reacting, and that is actually one of our very strong mottos, if you will. So nearly every office in our company has this poster that says speed is our only sort of big asset, right? Around 8 o'clock that evening, the announcement was made by Prime Minister Modi, and we actually reacted, and by next day morning, we could afford to have front cover newspapers in all major national dailies. I think that's speed. When we were at the same level of surprise as anybody else. Demonetization was useful to us and also to all other payment partners, I would say, because for some time there was no currency, so digital currencies were the only way out during that time. There was a 3-month period where you could not actually use currency in the way that you were used to. So that brought in a lot of merchants who found that launching a Paytm POS, which is actually literally just a QR code, was super simple, and anybody with an Android app or an iOS app could come and buy and sell goods with that. So we found a lot of uptake from merchants who did that. We had to do a lot of education. We actually educated not only our merchants, but also all sorts of government institutions. So there is a funny incident there. We wanted to tell merchants that they could actually just put a Paytm QR code on their shop and say Paytm accepted here. Now, the logistics of that was extremely difficult to pull out in this short time. So for a few days, we actually took out full-page ads, which literally had a part of the newspaper that you could cut out and just put it outside your shop. And that helped people just put a sticker saying, hey, Paytm accepted here, and that helped them.
So it wasn't just the fact that it happened, you also reacted incredibly quickly to it, and that was a big part of getting all those users.
Yeah.
Back to this payments bank, what are the banking ambitions, and in what way is there tension between Paytm and the traditional financial institutions in India, and in what ways are you working together?
I would say there is probably a bit of both, but way more of working together than tensions. We actually have helped in the proliferation of digital payments across to so many buyers and sellers that were simply not addressed. There were so many bank accounts with zero balances, or let's say almost less than 10% digital activation of ATM cards or anything other than the printed passbooks and going to the bank for each and everything. So today we've done the part of educating consumers. So I would say if you think of this as the pyramid, we actually went 2 notches down, and now digital payments is a possibility across the board. So till now we had current accounts and savings accounts, which are actually with every other bank, which were the ultimate sources of money. So people actually started moving money more in the economy, and all this money is digital, so it's definitely gives an opportunity to the government to tax it. That's one advantage. There is more money in the what's called the not black money market, and there is also a convenience in transactions. The offering that we have in our payment bank is current accounts and savings account. So we believe that we can actually use what we know about the person to serve that person when that person was typically not going to be served by somebody else. I'll give you an example. Our marketplace, we have a commerce arm. So on the app, we sell everything from shirts, shoes, televisions, everything. We actually partner with a couple of lending companies. So one of them is Capital Float, for example. It's very similar to Cabbage, if some people here know that name. And we work with them by sharing the data of that merchant in that marketplace. So if, for example, they've grown very rapidly and yet the customers are very happy with the kind of service that they provide, they are a potential to get a loan, and they would not have gotten a loan otherwise because they're a very new merchant. In India, typically, if you go to a bank and if you don't have 3 years of financial returns and you don't have your corporate score kept properly, there is no way you can get a loan. So this is actually an opportunity where those people get that loan.
And how do you compare that experience to what's happened in China? There's a similar, rapid leapfrogging, as people call it.
I think if what we are discussing in India is a leapfrog, China is a much more leapfrog. It's like a leapfrog over this leapfrog. In China, the use cases are not even funny. The score that you have from Alipay on your app is used not only to give you a loan, but it is almost like a social honesty score, if you will. Every time I go to China, there is a new understanding of, oh, that score is now used for this new purpose. So that I think is very radical. You make a simple payment at a 7-Eleven store or any other convenience store, you actually get not only the fact that you paid $2 to this merchant, but also what you bought. The invoice is integrated right within your app. So the smartphone, I think the capabilities of that have been really stretched in China.
So do you see Ant Financial as a model of what Paytm could become?
I'd say it's definitely a very good inspiration. The fact that we are friends with them gets us access to the story, because every now and then when we hear of, hey, this is what is happening over there, there is a lot of details that happen along the way. There were a lot of failed experiments that happen that make you reach that end point. So being good friends with them gives us access to the story and how some learnings were made and how some mistakes were made. Besides, we share on a lot of fronts, not only the business model and how the business model and the ecosystem evolved, but also on technology and other access to partners, as an example.
And so what's an example of one of the big mistakes that Ant made that you're hoping to avoid by knowing their story?
I can mention one around technology, for instance. So the Ant Financial Technology platform is now on its 5th generation. By my estimate, our technology platform is probably at the 2nd generation in that story. We are not building the 3rd generation. We are actually working with them on generation 6 together.
So what is that integration? Is this sort of integration together?
No, it's not. So it doesn't have to be integration. It is that when you go to this level of scale, so I'll give you an example. We do, well, at least 6 months ago, we were doing more than 10 million orders a day. And that's good scale. 10 million means that your systems, your processes, architecture has to be in a particular way. During Singles Day last year, they pulled off for a couple of hours a tad less than 200,000 orders a second. There is just so much to learn when you think about that sort of scale. So if we have to re-architect our systems and our processes, we now have the opportunity to see what the world looks like at that level and learn what they're doing and just jump to that level. So we can skip a couple of steps.
And Alibaba Ant are some of your big investors, as are Softbank. So in addition to providing you a lot of capital, and we've touched on this with Ant, what are some of the other benefits of having them as your investors?
So like I said, the partnerships, we actually recently announced that we would be integrating the catalogs from Taobao and Tmall as well, and offer them to Indian consumers. We announced interoperability between the Alipay wallets and the Paytm wallet. In fact, when we are discussing what we can do in Canada together, there is actually a global conversation happening with the large financial institutions around what we can do together across the board. So these are a few examples where it's not just, hey, we did this, so you should not do that. But we actually work as a set of partners doing payments innovation across everywhere where we are.
And what about Softbank? How have they been helpful?
Softbank is very new. They are a very useful partner for us for the wisdom in everything that they've done so far, and also, obviously, the money.
So on the money, the last round was $1.4 billion. Our sources say it was about a valuation of $7 billion.
If you say so, then it must be.
Is it high? Am I too low, too high?
It's close.
Close, okay. That's our Bloomberg sources. Okay, so what's the exit plan? When could you foresee an IPO, and where would you list?
200 million people sounds very good. But India alone has 1.2 billion people. And we think at least 800 million people should be on our network. We started in Canada. We have these many users in Canada. That's like 0 point something something of the total network. There is so much to be done. And we believe that till we have done this, there is a lot of journey in front of us, not only in terms of the number of users, the offering that we offer to them. The other interesting thing is that because of Ant Financial and because of Softbank, there is a different aspect of needing to go to an IPO. Sometimes you need to go to an IPO because there is somebody who needs to exit. I don't think we have anybody of our investors who's looking for that sort of a short-term exit and, yay, I'm sort of out of this thing. The reason I mentioned what all we can do is an ambition that is shared very consistently by people on our board. So we believe that wherever we are, we can actually become 100x of that. So there is no impatience, I would say.
Right, so not in the near term, but in the, I mean, if you had to put a timeline on it.
I honestly do not know what timeline we can put. I mean, the timeline should be when we have actually done the work that we have done, that we intend to do. And I honestly don't know how long that takes us.
So let's move on to competition. You're well ahead of all of the competition with more than 200 million users. I think your nearest competitor is maybe around like 55 million or so. Do you see your growth sustaining at that rate? Is growth tapering off? Are you worried about competition heating up?
So there's two kinds of growth. One is the number of users, 200 million, and I think 800 million adults in the country should definitely have Paytm. So there is just so much more to be done. I'll take our biggest category, which is bill payments. We don't even do 5% of the bill payments in the country today. There is so much more to be done. And then the other growth is around the services that we provide. If you download our app, there's actually maybe 15 or 20 icons on that app. You'd notice that every 2 months we add a new icon. Movies and travel did not exist a year ago. And today we are I think the number 2 in both these categories within less than a year of launch. We recently launched insurance payments, and we actually now sell cars and two-wheelers as well. So my point is that the number of services that we can add on the mobile phone for all these consumers is, we haven't even thought of all those use cases yet. So we are constrained by that. I think of this as still as early stages. The number of use cases that can actually come to the smartphone is still not done yet. The number of ways in which we can offer financial services to people who did not have access to those financial services is still not sorted out yet.
And what do you think about WhatsApp, for instance, getting into digital payments in India?
So I think more and more people in India have what I would say a digital way to get money. WhatsApp is definitely creating a very useful interface between those people. I mean, when you're chatting, you can actually do the money transfer to that person as well. To me, the size of the market is good enough. And I don't literally, we don't literally think that WhatsApp is going to take away something from us. If people are savvy, so I can send you an email on multiple interfaces. It doesn't have to be just one network. I mean, you have your corporate email and your personal email, they can exist. So I think of this as two networks, but they're interoperable, actually. WhatsApp supports UPI, we also support UPI. So maybe someday it is actually just the same thing.
And most of the early adopters of digital payments are in urban centers. What is Paytm doing to try to get those rural and semi-rural consumers?
So one of the things that helps us is that we are app-based, and we try to make it as much self-serve as possible. Where it is not possible to do self-serve, we actually have a trained field agent who we would onboard, and that person would be your local ambassador, if you will. So for instance, you need to give us your documentation so that we can open a bank account, and there is no bank branch nearby. We would actually use that field agent to do that. So in that sense, we are not constrained by having a presence in that rural area, because infrastructure is actually a much bigger concern in rural areas in India than in urban areas. We think that this is how we'll reach out to those people.
Interesting. And how important are those consumers going to be as you try to reach that total addressable market?
So the thing is, rural does not mean poor. That is not a correlation. We think that they were underserved only because the logistics did not allow for an institution to reach out to them. There were no economies of scale. And the fact that we have technology today, the fact that an app which anybody can nearly democratically download from wherever they are, and the fact that there are data networks and there is, the information gap is much lesser, it's truly that anybody in a rural city has just as much access to these tools that anybody else has.
And what about profitability? Is that a near-term goal? Paytm is known for having very good, discounts and cash backs. Are your consumers going to continue to see that?
So it is good that we have a brand name that Paytm is a very discounted place. But tell you what, within several categories, we are actually on a positive contribution margin, and several of those. So financial prudence is another thing that I will say is very much in our DNA. We are very aggressive for cashbacks and discounts when we are growing a category, but at the same time, we know how to balance it. And tell you what, our data really helps us do that very, very well. The more you understand your consumer, the more you know what is the right level of discounting that you need to do and so on. So as we are growing, there is new categories that are growing, and we are definitely spending on those new categories. But there are established categories that I would call, which definitely are not the ones in that.
And now there's been a big flurry of investments into FinTech in India. Of course, there was your fundraising and as well as many others. Do you think the space is overheated? Where do you think it goes from here?
Overheated? Simply no. One word reply. Like I said, I think there is a lot more to be done in FinTech than what we are doing today. It's a lot of inefficiencies. And I feel that because getting a loan for a house, getting a loan for your education is still a problem. And it is not correlated with, say, common sense. I know that in my case, when I went to study abroad, I had to take a big loan to pay for my tuition. And the only option that I had was to actually put my house for a mortgage, and I got 85% value of that house to go pay for my tuition. I didn't have a house, so actually I found somebody else who put their house over there, and that's how I got the loan and so on. It's inefficient because you actually have much better loans for students which actually take into account their future earning potential, and that's how they underwrite. The reason these systems don't exist in India so far is you don't have enough information. The credit bureau, if you will, the Equifax TransUnion, there is nothing equivalent of that in India. So our score, we believe, so we also have our own score in India. We call it Karma score. We believe that that score is a step where we actually can say, you know what, Harinder is probably worth it because, or Harinder is probably worth this much of risk on this amount of money because of what we know about Harinder. And that probably opens up more things. Can we do it all? We definitely don't think so, and there is definitely a lot of potential in companies doing that.
I want to talk a little bit about partnerships as well. So before you came to Canada, you had brokered a deal with Uber in India, which is a very important market for them. What was the deal-making process like there, and how important has that partnership been?
The deal-making process was long. I think we started in the very early part of 2014, and we announced it in the later months of 2014. We actually had been talking to every company based in the West that had an interest in coming to India. And that was part of my role. I was in Toronto, and I was just reaching out to these companies and figuring out what we could offer to them as a payment method. So I think one of the things that worked very well was that we had a dialogue with them for the longest time ever, so they understood us, and they sort of knew what we were offering. And also, we did a few custom workflows for them. We actually helped guarantee that the Uber workflow, which is, you just tap and you leave the car, you don't have to do any other confirmation, that was actually happening in our app. Till that time, we had not done this integration with any other merchant. So Uber was like the first merchant for which we did this. So that definitely helped. The funny thing around that is that I think we were mentioned on TechCrunch for the first time on that day, that Uber picks up this company from India and so on. And it was amusing for us because, well, it was some transactions. It was a lot of transactions. But we had been doing so much more already. And the fact that we got Uber got us a lot of attention. Oh, Uber picks up this company. And we are like, yeah, thank you for noticing us.
Finally, it does. Uber does do that to companies. Modi has been pretty friendly to the FinTech sector. What else would you like to see in an ideal world in terms of government regulation in India?
In an ideal world? I think we could do with a lot more transparency in terms of the regulation that is passed. I would definitely want to compliment and comment on the forward thinking that the Reserve Bank of India has. I mean, when you think of any other Indian government organization, you don't think very highly, but I have to say that having dealt with Reserve Bank of India is a pleasure. They are a very forward-looking regulator. They've actually had to balance all the technology advances that are happening and also the needs of the lowest person on the pyramid. And they do a very good job of that. And they've been very supportive of ideas and also being very creative. Well, creative and regulator doesn't sound right in the same sentence, but I would say that they have been very innovative in figuring out what the right model is to actually bring digital payments to the country. And the PPI license, the prepaid instrument license, was actually one step, and the next step of that is the payments bank. Other than that, I think all government institutions, we've been very tightly integrated with them at the city level, the provincial level, and also the federal level. When demonetization happened, we actually were working with them very closely to help both consumers and the government side. What would I expect more to happen? Transparency. I love transparency, and I think that solves a lot of problems in a large democracy like ours.
So, last question here. What do you see when you look at the financial technology innovation in America? Are there startups that you think are doing interesting things that could be relevant to Paytm, that Paytm could learn from, invest in, partner in?
So we are just starting in North America right now. And what we're really seeking right now is companies that bring us access to more users and companies who have more knowledge about what the consumer needs are. And it's really an open sort of landscape for us right now. there is a lot of interesting companies that reach out for all sorts of lending options and also insurance options. We think that we have a lot of these problems solved at a much larger scale, so we could partner with them on those. I guess the answer is on a case-to-case basis, but we are definitely interested in talking to all spectrum of technology companies, of fintech companies.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Harinder, for a very interesting conversation.
Thank you.